Hi, I'm Matt Westcott. I'm the tech lead of Wagtail, the leading Django-based content management system, and you might have seen me around on GitHub as Gasman. I'm going to start this talk off with a hot take. Django is lagging behind in its ability to deliver the rich client-side user experiences that people expect today. That might seem like an unfair charge to level at a backend framework, so maybe I should justify that. In the early days of Django, the kind of client-side code that would be in use on a website would have been something like this. So showing or hiding the state drop-down depending on whether the country is set to United States or not. Or just postcode lookups, auto-completion, these sorts of enhancements that don't fundamentally change the principle that the server is doing all the hard work. None of the client-side code really needs to know much about what sort of data it's dealing with. These interactions can be written as very simple rules at the HTML level if the element with ID country has a value equal to United States, show the element with ID state. And none of this code cares what a country or a state actually is. That's the server's business. This is just HTML elements. And we have libraries like jQuery, which are really good at that, manipulating web pages at the level of HTML fragments. And while Django is a server-side framework that generally leaves the details of front-end code up to you, there are traces of this thinking in Django's design. So in particular, form sets have this empty form property, which gives you the HTML for an empty form with a placeholder for the prefix, with the intent that you can use this for dynamically inserting new forms, like I'm doing here. And you do that, you render that that form in a script tag. This is one way of doing it, where we've set the type to something made up. This is a trick for just stashing strings in the document and just keeping them as plain strings, because the browser will just skip over any content types it doesn't recognize. So this is just a string that we can grab from our JavaScript code, and whenever we click that button, we'll create a new list element, write the HTML into it with this prefix filled in, and then update the form count in the hidden input. And again, this is just naive HTML manipulation. None of the JavaScript code knows what data this is representing. There is no array of voucher code objects anywhere. But if we think of a more complicated example, like a Facebook-style messaging system, when a message comes in, then sure, there's an HTML element that pops up in the corner of the screen, but maybe it also adds the little sort of red badge to the menu bar, updates the title element, and in your sort of contact list, it will sort of flash the contact red and just put a little snippet of the message underneath that person. And in the traditional Django /jQuery mindset, where the server-side logic reigns supreme and the client is a passive window onto that server-side state, you could treat this as just a set of HTML manipulations to perform, where let's say a message has come in from user ID 12345, so let's find the element with ID user 12345, flash it red, find the span with class name message snippet inside it, and update that with the message text. And yes, in principle you can do everything that way, just as anything you can do in a Django site you could equally do with PHP and raw SQL queries. But clearly it's much more expressive and easier to code when the environment you're working in has a concept of the data model. This is a message, it has a timestamp, a sender, that sender is a person who has a message history, and we add that new message to the message history, and any view side components that represent that person and that message can then update themselves to reflect that change. And this is the selling point of frameworks like React and Vue. It gives the front-end code access to that data model. We're no longer just working with HTML fragments. And plenty of Django developers have seen the value of working with React and Vue and so on. And now it's quite common to build your project's front end in one of those frameworks. Talking to a JSON API, most likely built in Django REST framework when we need to get data from the server. But that way you end up leaving behind a huge part of the Django ecosystem, like templating and forms. It's two different worlds. It's the first question that a developer starting a new project has to ask. Am I going to build this as a traditional Django website with views, templates, forms and so on, or am I going to build it as a React app? Now, on Wagtail, we didn't even have the luxury of making that choice. Those of you who've used Wagtail before will hopefully be familiar with Streamfield, which allows you to insert and arrange of mixed content blocks of various types. And the developer can specify which kinds of blocks and fields are available here. And while there are quite a few Wagtail specific conventions you need to follow, this is ultimately a Django form. These are Django form widgets, and when the form is submitted, it will all be handled by the Django Forms framework. And this is important to us as Wagtail developers. We want Wagtail to be the best Python Django CMS, and that means embracing the Django ecosystem. If a developer wants to customize how this works, or there is a third-party color picker or date picker or autocomplete input that they want to use, they should be able to use their Django knowledge to do that. And if instead we end up saying, sure, yes, you can do that, you just need to rewrite it all as a React component, then we've kind of failed at that goal. We might be the world's best React CMS, but that's not what a Django dev wants to hear. So what we've ended up with is basically the same mechanism as these dynamic form sets, but turned up to 11. It's if the page you're editing here has a gallery of 10 image objects on it, then you will have when we load this page, it will have to render 10 copies of this subform. And if you want to add another one, then there will be an empty form stashed away in one of these fake script tags somewhere on the document, and it will duplicate and clone that one, just as we saw before. And it's the same for any other block type, and these blocks might themselves have dynamic elements in them too. So there's a lot of complexity going on in here, and we're really at the upper limit of what we can reasonably do with pure HTML manipulation. And it would really be a whole lot easier if we could say, okay, to the client side, this is the data for 10 images. Here's the structure of a form for editing those images, so give me 10 instances of that form, all populated. But we can't do that when we're only working at this sort of opaque HTML level, where the client-side code doesn't have an insight into that actual data. And you might be wondering, well, what is the barrier to getting at the data directly? Why do we have to work with these HTML fragments? Well, as I said, we're committed to working with Django form widgets. That's a choice we've made as developers of Wagtail. And the ability to interface with form widgets from client-side code has never been part of the contract that Django laid down. Form widgets care about two things. Firstly, given some data on the Python side, they can render some blob of HTML that represents that data in a form field. And secondly, if you stick that blob of HTML in a form and submit it, that widget knows how to make sense of that submission and get data back out of it. That's all happening on the Python side, and what happens in between those points is entirely private to that widget. But come on, you might say, we know HTML, we know what an input element looks like. How hard can it really be to get data in and out of them from JavaScript code? Well, let's take a look at some of them, starting with plain text inputs. So this is what it looks like. That's the HTML for it. So how do we get the value out of that? Well, okay, this is not a trick question. It's document.getElement.byId title.value. So yeah, just hack around with the value property and to put data into it, value equals goodbye world. So that's pretty easy. So moving on, how about a choice field using radio buttons? So here's the HTML for that, and okay, now it's not quite as simple as just saying dot value, because there are a bunch of different inputs and only one of them, the one with checked attribute on it, is the one that we're actually interested in. So it's sort of a slightly different bit of code, still nothing nothing catastrophically complex, but it's just annoyingly different. You just need to look for the right element with that attribute, or to writing back to it, make sure you're matching it by ID and then setting checked. So yeah, just not difficult, just different. Now let's take one of our sort of fancy image choosers, and this is, yeah, as we've seen here, this is something specific to Wagtail, and it's and yes, there's lots of custom JavaScript going on here, but it's still ultimately a form widget. It follows the contract of form widgets as specified by Django, being able to get data in and out of it from Python. And so the HTML for that, well, we've got hidden inputs, so at least we know what to do with that. We can get the ID out, but if we're actually populating this field with data, if we're rendering this form entirely client-side, we can't just fill in the ID and call it done. We've also got this to set the URL for this thumbnail image and populate the URL for the edit this image, and if all you've got is the ID to go on, you just don't have the data to do that, so you're kind of stuck. You're if your client-side code doesn't have specific knowledge of what's going on in this particular component, then it won't have a hope of doing the right thing. And I won't even start on how things like rich text work. That's just you just don't want to know, not today anyway. So what we need, and what Django doesn't give us here, is a standardized API, a standardized JavaScript API for getting at the data contained in form fields, one that works regardless of whether they're bog standard HTML inputs or fancy JavaScript components. That knowledge exists on the Python side in the form object and in the form widget classes. What we'd really like to do is take those definitions and zap them over to the client side. In short, what we need is Telepath. So Telepath isn't a large-scale framework in the way that something like React is. It does one thing, transporting object data from Python to JavaScript. If you're familiar with the pickle functionality from the Python standard library, where you can take an arbitrary Python object, serialize it, and then write it to disk or whatever you want, and then at some later point read it back, unpack it, and get back the Python object again, then this is the same as that, but when you're unpickling on the client side and getting back JavaScript objects. Or if you prefer, it's a more generalized version of JSON that you can teach about new object types. So there's a demo of that. So let's say, we've got a Django form here, the sort of thing that we might use in Wagtail for placing an image on a page. In fact, let me just grab the definition of that. You can see we're using one of our Wagtail specific admin image choosers there, but besides that, this is just a completely typical Django form. So we can fill this in. Let's use this picture of some cakes just to make you all hungry, and fill that caption in. And the new thing that Telepath gives us, the interesting bit, is now that we can grab this form state as a JSON-like structure, and this is entirely client-side. There's no round trip to the server to obtain this data, and it includes data like this preview thumbnail URL, which is not contained in a form field. You couldn't do that by digging around with some naive code that just looks at input fields. And this gives us everything that we need to work with this form on the client at the actual data level. So if we just change this caption, and maybe we want that right aligned, then we can push that data back to the form, and then it will do the right kind of manipulations to the form to update that. And if we change this image, let's just set all that to just null, and then set that across, then it also knows the right sort of updates to do to our custom image widget, including sort of setting this back to the placeholder image. And this works because we've taken our Django form definition and we've got Telepath to build a corresponding JavaScript object with the API that we need. And if we open up developer tools, we can actually sort of see what playing around with that object looks like. I've given it the name just form. We can say form.widgets, and if we get the caption object, get its state, and then set its state to something else. And then so we've got a full JavaScript API to sort of do sort of any kind of data level manipulations we want. And within Wagtail, this opens up a whole lot of functionality that we just couldn't do before, such as duplicating blocks. Let's just make an edit there and then duplicate that. It will read the data from one form and push it back to another, and we can just render those dynamically. And we can also, if I change that, we can collapse this block, and we get this sort of little preview snippet of what's in here, and it's possible for us to do that because we have access to the data within the form, so we can dynamically generate that. So digging into a bit more on how this demo works. So on the Python side, we have our form instance that we build as normal, and then we ask Telepath to generate this packed version of it. This condenses the definition of the form object into a JSON serializable representation, which we then include on the template. I'll show you that in a moment. And this is done through this JS context object, and the idea here is that whatever objects we send to the pack method, when we come to unpack them at the other end on the client side, there will be some JavaScript implementation for that object in a .js file somewhere, which then needs to be included on the template. And Telepath keeps track of where those implementations can be found, and makes them available through a media object. If you've used Django's the form media, this is just one of those. And so what we get out after we've turned that into JavaScript objects is this client-side form object which offers you the nice data access API that I just showed you. And so if I add, say, a credit field, well, before I add this, let's show you what's going on the in the source code. So you can see that the definition of the form object is this sort of custom dialect of JavaScript of JSON, and we've stashed that into one of our fake script tags. You don't need to understand this format, but you can see it has these references to types that we've defined elsewhere: image chooser, radio select, and if you scroll up, you can see these media definitions. Those have been output on there. So these contain the definitions of these types here. So then we read that definition and then get Telepath to unpack it, and at this point it's got all of the JavaScript definitions it needs. So if we add another char field to our form, just changing vanilla Django code again, and if I refresh that, oops, should have waited for it to reload. There we go. And now you can see that we've got this credit as part of the definition, and it's got this custom definition of this widget object. So now these JavaScript implementations, they don't come out of nowhere. This isn't some kind of magic Python to JavaScript converter for your business logic. And behind the curtain, these JavaScript implementations of the Django form and widget objects are things that I've created as part of the Telepath ecosystem. Calling it an ecosystem at this point might be a bit grandiose given how new Telepath is, but the point is, form widgets are only one possible application of this. It's perhaps the most the most obviously useful application when we're talking about Django functionality that we'd like to interface with JavaScript. But Telepath can be used anywhere that you have a server-side data representation in Python objects that you want to share with front-end code. So to finish, I'll give you a fairly silly example that demonstrates the possibility end-to-end. So here we have some bouncing emoji, and if I bring up the code for that, it's this one. You can see that each emoji is a Python object with a name and a size property, and we're defining our list of emojis in Python code. We're sending that to packing that up with Telepath to send that to the template as before. On the template, we're writing out that that packed JSON definition, and then we're unpacking that, well, grabbing that from the script tag, unpacking that in Telepath, and calling animate on each one. And the JavaScript code for that, let's just enlarge that a bit so you can see the whole thing, is a JavaScript class that is called emoji. It has two properties, name and size, that get passed to the constructor, and an animate method. And we're taking this, so the one piece of glue to make Telepath work with this, we're registering this class with Telepath under the name sprites.emoji, and that is, and if we go back to the Python code, you'll see that we've got this Telepath pack method which defines everything it needs to know about how to turn a Python emoji object into a JavaScript one. So firstly, whenever this pack method encounters an emoji object, we know we'll have to insert our emoji.js as part of the JavaScript media definition. So we'll add that one in there, and then we are going to use the class that we've registered as sprites.emoji and pass it the name and size properties from the Python object, and from there Telepath will take care of encoding that into the data structure that it packs up to send to the front end. And as far as the transporting from Python to JavaScript is concerned, that's all there is to it. So if we want to add a new kind of sprite to this display, let's say we want to add a text banner, so we can say banner hello DjangoCon, and let's make that purple. And obviously this is a new kind of Python object that we need to define. And same as before, but this time we'll give it text and color properties. And well, let's move on to the JavaScript implementation of a banner, and I'm just going to steal most of this from the emoji implementation. So this is now class banner. It will take text and color. Inner text will be text. Font size we will hard code to 40px. We'll set our color to whatever we passed, and everything else can remain the same, I think. So we've now got our banner object, which will sort of render our text element and give us the ability to animate it, and now we'll register that with Telepath under the name sprites.banner, and then back in our Python code we'll define a telepath pack method, which this time we need to bring in banner.js. Sprites.banner is the class name that we registered that we will pull in, that we'll use for to instantiate this banner object, and that is going to be passed these two parameters, size and color. And finally we have to use this telepath.register decorator, which tells Telepath that this is now one of the object types that it should support. So now if I save that, wait a moment for it to reload everything, and now hopefully, no, still reloading, and there we go, we've got our hello DjangoCon banner. So that's a Python object that we just invented like 2 minutes ago, popping up in the browser as an object on the JavaScript side in its own right. And while this is a silly example, hopefully you can see the potential of sharing the business objects from your Django application with front-end code. And in Wagtail's case, these business objects are forms, and this has solved a huge tricky problem for us. And maybe you have something similar in your project, or something entirely different, where Telepath as a mechanism for sharing logic can offer you a new kind of solution. So you can find Telepath on PyPI. It's called Telepath, and the documentation and GitHub project will be all linked from there. So thank you very much. A huge tricky problem for us.
Hi, Matt.
Maybe you have something
Hello.
similar in
Great
your
talk.
project, or something entirely
Just
different.
one question.
Where
Why do you need the Telepath register? Why do you need that decorator on the backend side and on the client side too?
I suppose in that particular case, it wouldn't really be sort of needed, because it would be able to figure out where the based on the fact that you've got the telepath pack method, what to do with it. I think where that really comes in is when you're packing objects that you don't have direct control of in your own code. So that would be things like Django form widgets, which obviously we can't easily add that to the Django code. So in that case, there's an alternative way of registering an adapter where it's an external class. So I think that just kind of keeps it a bit more sort of consistent between those two approaches.
Okay, thank you.
Chris has just arrived, so I can answer the question I was about to answer on Slack about examples of this in use in Wagtail. So I think there is. I'm trying to think of the best place to look. So all the front end code in the Wagtail repo is in the most of the front end code is in the client subfolder, and there's a few, the place where we are working with those Django form widgets is in the widgets.js, which I will try and dig out and put the link into chat. So it's So this is one thing I was hoping to have done in time for this talk, but didn't quite get around to, was taking the sort of, code for dealing with the Django widgets and forms and putting that in its own package. At the moment, that code is sort of tied into Wagtail a bit, but hopefully this week I'll have a chance to split that out so that that's usable outside of Wagtail itself.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Can I ask a question? You just jump in.
Yep, sure.
Yeah, it's super cool. I'm curious, like, it makes a ton of sense for the Django forms use case. I'm curious, like, if you were, if you didn't have to sort of embed it in this complex Python object that you don't fully control, like, how would you think about when you would want to use this versus just using something like React or Vue on the front end, and sort of like passing normal JSON and APIs back and forth?
I think if you've already sort of got some investment into a sort of conventional Django app where you're rewriting everything in React isn't really an option, then I think this is probably the way to bridge that gap. I think there's a few other places that we've started to find a use of this in Wagtail. So I think we're looking at rebuilding the left-hand menu in the admin interface so that each menu item is a telepath object, and that's and I think that's where it really helps, because we're building the definition of which menu items are shown to someone is all in Python logic. I suppose, for a lot of things, you might not need something as complex as Telepath that can sort of pack arbitrary objects. You could get pretty far with just objects that just basic JSON definitions as like dictionaries. I think where this really helps is where you have kind of nested structures of objects that sort of don't really know about each other. So in the case of Wagtail in the screen field, each block can have sub-blocks and they can be mixed and matched in any combination. So I think where you've got that sort of more extensible data model, I think that's where this is really where you get the most benefit from that.
Makes sense. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Matt. That was really interesting. I'd like to know, are you tracking the use of this outside your own Wagtail Torchbox community to find out, do you have a sense of who's using it and what use cases it's finding out there in the wide world?
I'm not really tracking that at the moment. I think my impression is that there's probably very little right now because it is pretty new. I think this is probably the first time I've really introduced it as a project in its own right, as opposed to something that fixed a problem within Wagtail. But I'm definitely keen to see how it evolves from here. As I said, I need to open up the code for working with forms and form widgets, which I think is where it's going to become really useful. But I think this is just the start.
I assume it's going to explode with interest following this talk.
Yeah, I hope so.
Thanks. Really great. Antonis, I think you were going to speak, so I'll go since I've already spoken.
Okay. Hello, Matt. I was going to ask, is this more of a backwards compatibility thing? I mean, you have an old style web application and you want to add some reactivity to it, so it helps you do that. For new applications, would you recommend going the React or the Vue way?
I think it has a place for both. I think if you're most confident in working in the Django way, then I think it probably is. Or you have the requirements to integrate with the Django ecosystem more closely than you would be able to do if your front end was just React and you were just talking to Django just through the REST API. So I think wherever it makes most sense to communicate with Django as a backend, which might be something like the channels chat application that we just saw in the last talk, and I think that would be a good fit for Telepath.
I have another question, if I may, having had one already. There's quite not an ecosystem, but there's quite a set of approaches to front-end work within Python appearing now. Everything from Anvil and libraries that you can use in Python to generate JavaScript. Where do you see the overlaps? How does this fit in with other efforts to put more power in the hands of the Python developer? And yeah, that's it. How does it fit in that picture of these many different solutions to a similar question?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I've noticed as the schedule for this talk was coming through, I thought, there's quite a lot of front end. So I'm looking forward to learning more about what else is out there over this week. I think where Telepath comes in, I think it's sort of solving like one specific problem relating to like transporting data around. So I'm hoping that this isn't necessarily this is the one framework that you have to adopt. It should integrate nicely with anything else, as long as it ultimately talks in the plain JavaScript objects. So hopefully it should sort of integrate well with the existing sort of frameworks, whether that's Python or JavaScript, but that's something that we'll be learning more about and adapting as the project grows. Okay, I've got a couple of questions in the chat. So we're talking about validation. So yeah, I think that's kind of one missing part of what I've built in the form handling so far. So we've got the rendering of the forms and the form widgets, and the validation happens in Django terms on the field object, and we don't really have a concept of that yet. I think there's certainly a lot of validation that you can do usefully on the client side, and I think that will be a useful addition to what Telepath provides. There's certain things that can't be done the client side if it's like validating that a username isn't taken, for example. Although even then, you could usefully do a sort of a background query to check that. So I think so. That's not something I've looked into, but I'm hoping that's something that Telepath can fill a need for. And how easy it is to use with web components instead of native controls. Again, that's a good question. I've not really looked into that. I think that's the next thing that we'll be discovering as we sort of start migrating Wagtail's menus into to this new framework, because that's I think that there's some React involved there. So yeah, we're still on the way to discovering that.
I have a question about if you have any extra security like middleware, because usually serialization is serialization of objects between parts of an application is an entry point for some vulnerabilities sometimes. Historically, I don't know if this specific library has an extra explicit layer to handle that, or no, just wondering.
No, it's not. That's not something we've designed into it. I think the expectation is that when you're defining the mapping from Python objects to the client side, the JavaScript ones, then because you're specifying which parameters are being passed on, then you will always have sort of control over which data gets passed on, and only sort of passing on information that the client is supposed to know. And
I'm here with Stefan.
I suppose, yeah, there is the general thing about whenever you're working over any sort of API, you need to make sure you're not trusting the client.
Yeah, just the regular, the regular security concerns everyone should have.
Yeah.
Well, let's start it right at the beginning.
Thank you.
I'm mostly a Python user and an occasional Django user. So Django is not really my
see the
original
next
focus,
talk has
which is why I
started
learned
now,
SQL
so
before I learned
I'm
Django.
happy to stick
And
around
I
if there are
always went
more
for
questions.
There's one extra question
I
on
the Django RM
chat.
to implement
How easy
something
would it be to
or
use
using
Telepath to
just
allow
just
front-end editing of screen
And
fields
I
outside of the
realized-
admin backend?
Yeah.
So yeah, that is that's something that we're really keen to do, is to make sure that we've got this this accessible API for working with Screenfield data and the Screenfield interface without that being tied into all of the admin's own JavaScript. So it's not something that we've worked on yet, but I think that is definitely kind of top of the list of the next bit of development. Is I know people have been interested in creating more front-end user-facing interfaces for editing screen fields. So yeah, we really do want to do more work on that, and I think we're sort of a lot closer there. There's probably open questions in certain block types, like the rich text and the that image choosers, which are more tied in to the Wagtail admin interface than others would be. But obviously the thing about Screenfield is that you can choose as a developer which blocks are available. So maybe that's not a blocker for sort of building these interfaces for making this available to the front end. So yeah, I think that's definitely something we're keen to look into as a next step on this.
For the moment, let's just assume that we go for either our approach. So you would
Okay, so you use a variant version of Django built in the filter JSON script instead of save. Yes, I think so. I think this is that's something that I only just learned about sort of in the last week or two, and I sort of felt this and I should use that a lot more. And yeah, I think that is something that's kind of low level bothered me about embedding sort of bits of JSON into script tags, is that what if it contains a closing script tag, and I see it's accounting for that. So yeah, we should I should probably update my examples if I am still using script to using save to use JSON script instead.
In order to, well, not to run into too many.
You have another question. What about the front-end editing for Wagtail? Is a different question. It's not related to Telepath, maybe.
And so it's more being able to edit pages through front-end templates. You mean?
Yes. Yeah. Do you think is in the future Wagtail will support the front-end editing or only preview?
Okay. So being able to sort of WYSIWYG editing,
or something like the Django CMS way. I don't know. What do you think about the front-end editing?
Now,
it's not really something we thought about in as something for Wagtail itself. It could certainly be. I could see that being done as maybe a third-party add-on. I think. The thing is, Wagtail does try not to be sort of opinionated about any particular whatever you're using on the front end, whether that's sort of CSS or JavaScript frameworks. So it might be that the mechanism for editing on the front end will be different for everyone. I think doing that within a third-party package makes it easier for that to be more opinionated about one way of building the front end. So I think, yeah, so certainly something I could see happening in the wider Wagtail ecosystem.
Okay, thank you.
You have products that are sold. Okay, now we'll look shortly over multiple scenarios on how to use the Django ORM, and we will compare them to the SQL that Django creates in the background.
Sounds like, yeah.
The motivation is, well, twofold.
Might be about done. So yeah, so if there are no more questions, I think, yeah, shall we wrap up here? So yeah, thanks everyone for your interest, and yeah, you can find me on Slack, and yeah, I'll be around for the rest of the week. So yeah, thanks for all your questions. Yeah, great talking to you.
Who has a discount
See you.
of 10, and then I can work with this customer, change his discount, delete him again.